Walmart. There are huge amounts of money to be made by for-profit companies in an area, public schooling, that historically they've been excluded from, and they want a piece of it. Actually, they want all of it. Unimaginably vast is how, in an interview I did with Benno Schmidt, who's a major player in the burgeoning new education industry, a former president of Yale University, unimaginably vast is how he described this potential new market. Education is bigger, he said, than defense, bigger than the whole domestic auto industry. Only healthcare, he said, has a larger segment of the American marketplace. There's gold in those hills. And corporations are working hard to tap this new profit potential. More schools are being run by publicly traded companies known as EMOs, education management organizations, like health management organizations. For-profit companies are playing increasing roles training teachers, providing standardized tests and curricula, wiring schools, food, janitorial, transportation, security services. In short, corporations are on their way to taking over the public education system in the United States and turning it into a market-driven, profitable enterprise. And they're doing this with the complicity, indeed, encouragement of state governments and an allegedly progressive federal government. This is an early warning signal, I believe, for us here in Canada. It's not happening yet, but we have to be careful. And as you well know, the same kind of corporatization and privatization logic extends across the public sector. It's not limited to education. And it's operating here in Canada, as you well know, not just in the United States. And importantly, it is not confined to public services, but it extends as well to the public regulatory system, where regulatory regimes are being rolled back and the budgets and staff of regulatory agencies are routinely cut. And again here, it's this notion of corporations as benevolent, as good citizens and leaders, that is justifying the deregulation trend. Corporations are socially, and I mean, everywhere I go to, conferences, interviews with business people, this linkage between deregulation and social responsibility is made. And the argument is that corporations are socially responsible, so hey, we don't need to regulate them. They can regulate themselves. The logic was nicely described in an interview I did with Samir Jabara, the former chair and CEO of Goodyear Tire. And I'll just read to you what he said, because it just captures it perfectly. Corporations need to become more trustworthy, he said, because there's been a transfer of authority from the government to the corporation. And the corporation needs to assume that responsibility and needs to really behave as a corporate citizen of the world, needs to assume the self-discipline that in the past governments required from it. Or, as former Labour British Prime Minister Gordon Brown stated, we can and should now abandon, quote, the old regulatory system, close quote, and rely instead on, quote, trust in the responsible corporation. And this was a Labour Prime Minister. Now this presumes, of course, that corporations can be trustworthy, and that corporate trustworthiness and self-regulation can be substitutes for public regulation. Pure fantasy, I would suggest, in light of the true institutional nature of the corporation, which, as I've argued elsewhere, is legally constituted to be socially irresponsible, to be, in effect, as was pointed out, psychopathic. Yet, and this is the problem, yet corporations are succeeding in positioning themselves as socially responsible, as trustworthy, as committed and capable leaders on environmental and social issues, as worthy to be trusted to self-regulate. I mean, Walmart and Nike have invested millions of dollars in sustainability programs, up and down their supply chains. Nike recently said, quote, we're integrating sustainability principles into everything we do. Many environmentalists and activists are working with these and other companies that are doing the same. And governments are deregulating them, confident that they can now regulate themselves. It is all so powerfully seductive. The idea of the good corporation, I mean, when I'm watching hockey games, all those tar sand companies, I mean, the production values are incredible. The beautiful animation and shots of people running through fields. And I mean, it's seductive. And many people are being seduced. But it's profoundly misleading and profoundly dangerous. Think for just a moment about Walmart and Nike and their sustainability programs. While trumpeting sustainability, both companies continue aggressively to promote the expansion and growth of consumer markets. And in doing so, what they're doing is conveying the message ideologically that sustainability is perfectly consistent with spiraling consumerism and rising brand and corporate power. That's the inevitable message. It's one step forward and 3 steps back, is how one critic of Walmart, Stacy Mitchell, has described it when the concept of sustainability is narrowed in this way to questions about how goods are produced and distributed, but excludes questions about what kinds of goods and in what quantities can be sustainably produced. As a result of this kind of narrowing, political scientist Peter DeBurn out at UBC, a colleague of mine, has observed, quote, "The big brand takeover of sustainability is shifting the purpose and goal of sustainability governance toward the need to create business value and away from more far-reaching understandings of the concept." So what it all boils down to, if I can summarize before providing some concluding thoughts. What it all boils down to is that whether we're talking about public services like schools, education, or public regulation like that related to environmental sustainability, private actors, large for-profit corporations, are vying, with considerable success, I might add, and with the complicity of governments, for if not the main role in society of delivering public goods and protecting public interests. And further compounding the problem, faith and trust in governments and in public institutions are at all-time lows. All of which creates a lot of confusion, going back to my opening point, especially for us on the left. Because as social democrats and as democratic socialists, we have believed historically that governments and public institutions, not private institutions, but governments and public institutions can and should play the leading, proactive, positive role in meeting public needs and serving public interests and redistributing wealth and protecting our environments and all of that. But the last 30 years of deregulation, of privatization, of slashing public services, of increasingly cozy relationships among governments, industries, and corporations, all of this has had the effect of turning the hero of our story, governments, into a villain, or at least an accomplice of villains. So there's a lot of legitimate distrust of government today on the left, a sense that governments are part of the problem and are no longer reliably part of the solution. And what that means is that many of the people and constituencies, especially among youth, who should and would be fighting for progressive democratic governance have turned to other places to do their politics. To the streets, as with the Occupy movement, to NGOs, and as I've been suggesting, to corporations, to the corporate social responsibility and sustainability movements. So while the right distrusts government because it threatens to restrain capital, the left distrusts government because capital restrains it. And the net result, no one trusting government, is of course a complete victory for big business, whose interests have always lain with distrusted and therefore weak and ineffective governments, at least when those governments are pursuing the people's interests rather than corporations' interests. So what do we do? A speech like this can be a bit of a downer if there isn't a happy ending. Well, I'm not going to provide a happy ending. I'll try to provide an optimistic ending. Needless to say, I can't give you a complete answer in the few minutes remaining, and truth be told, even if I had a few days with you, I likely couldn't give you a complete answer as to what we need to do. But let me put a few ideas on the table. The first thing we need to do, I think, is to recognize and to recommit to the central tenets of the left, the ones I described earlier, to the notion that creating good and just societies requires commitment to certain values and social goods that can only be realized through the proactive initiatives of robust and democratic and public institutions. We need to recognize, as no doubt all of you do in this room, we need to recognize and we need to get the message out that despite their clever and seemingly inspirational corporate social responsibility campaigns, despite their endless claims to be the good guys, to be trustworthy, to care about society and the environment, despite the often genuine and sincere commitments of their employees and managers to act in socially responsible ways, despite all of that, corporations do not and cannot attach any intrinsic value to social and environmental interests. They are not programmed to do that. And you can read my book to find out why in more detail if you want, or see the film. Those interests, those social and environmental interests may be superficially and strategically endorsed in public relations and marketing campaigns, but they may just as likely be vigorously opposed, less publicly and usually behind closed doors, when they demand policies that clash with corporate bottom lines. In the end, public institutions, democratic governments, whatever else may be said of them, are the only institutions in our current society that have the authority, that have the legitimacy, that have the mandate, and that have the capacity to establish the public-oriented rules, standards, policies, programs that we need to create good, sustainable, and just societies. So we on the left need to get that message out. The message that to the extent we abandon government, to the extent we distrust government rather than working to make government trustworthy, to that extent we abandon our best hope. We need to occupy Wall Street, and we need to occupy the streets, and we need to idle no more, but we also need to occupy government. We need to occupy the public sphere. So we need to restore our trust in government by working as citizens to create governments that deserve our trust. We need to have faith that with the right kind of work, government can again be the force for progressive change that we on the left have traditionally expected and demanded it to be. It would be absolute folly to abandon government because corporate capitalism is not abandoning government. It depends entirely on a massive intervention of the state and the government to create markets, to protect property rights, to create corporations. It's an absolutely foolish idea that somehow there is this thing called a free market that's pre-political. The market is created by government. And if the government's going to be facilitating and creating the conditions for capital accumulation, well, then we better be there too to make sure it doesn't do it in ways that ruin the environment and that ruin people's lives. Now, it's not like we haven't been doing this work all along. Our unions, particularly those in the public sectors, teachers, health workers, librarians, have been taking brave stands, courageously fighting to defend our public services against privatization, against cutbacks, against contracting out. First Nations people have been fighting for justice in terms of their land, in terms of self-government, in terms of idling no more. The activist groups, numerous activist groups, defending rivers and forests from commercialization and privatization, fighting for social and economic justice and equality. Local governments, city councils, becoming activist leaders, it's a beautiful thing to see, on key issues. Opposing GMO crops and trees in Richmond and several other cities. Allying themselves with First Nations to oppose the Northern Gateway Pipeline in Smithers and other northern cities. All of this is inspiring. There are so many sources of hope and so many more than I can list here. And then, of course, last, but certainly not least, there is the CCPA. The organization we are supporting and celebrating tonight, which for years has inspired and informed us with its work to illuminate how public policy can be used to create good, just, and sustainable societies. Most recently, the CCPA has launched, and Seth mentioned this, launched a new project, which I'm honored to be a part of, that asks directly the question, how do we restore public trust and public faith in public institutions and democratic governments? And that is, I believe, it should be clear from everything that I've been saying, that is an absolutely crucial question to be asking now. And it's an absolutely crucial question because we as a society, we are at a crossroads. We're facing a choice between, on the one hand, continuing to weaken our public governance systems, continuing to privatize, continuing to depend more and more on corporations to govern themselves and govern societies, and on the other hand, revitalizing our democratic governance and public institutions, bringing them closer to their justifying ideals, making them more effective and better able to promote and protect public interests, the people's interests. We have an opportunity in May to make some movement on this, and I am really inspired and delighted by that fact. Keep kicking those dogs in Yaletown, Adrian Dix. That's what I say. So, I think we can all agree that this latter road, the road that veers to the left, the road that revitalizes public institutions and democratic governance, that is the road that we need to take. And I want to thank the CCPA, and I want to thank all of you in this room, from the labor movement, from the social justice movement, from the environmental movement, from the human rights movements, from all of these movements. I want to thank all of you for working to make sure that that's the road that we do take. Thank you very much.